It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you the Ontario Regional Chief, RoseAnne Archibald of the Takwagon-Tagamu Nation. Her First Nation colleagues elected her as Ontario Regional Chief in June 2018. Ontario Regional Chief Archibald has spent her life to serve and to create a better quality of life and future for First Nations people. After a successful career in political leadership that spanned 25+ years, RoseAnne began a successful consulting business in 2009, providing advice and guidance to First Nation leaders and organizations specializing in negotiations and facilitation. As Ontario's regional chief, she remains dedicated to empowering women and youth in seeking community-based solutions that encourage capacity building, leadership developments, and resiliency. Chief RoseAnne Archibald.
Ochimiswe, RoseAnne Archibald Nitishnakasan, Dago Dagmao Ishnakatel Kochian, Monish Kokoyas Kashkitan Gichini Moyan, Sagoshmaga Nikisnomasan Gichinita Moyan. In my language, I just said that my name is RoseAnne Archibald and I'm from Takwagon-Tagamu Nation. Ninanaskamun Lin for the introduction. It's an honor to speak to you today. Ninanaskamun means I am grateful, I am thankful, I thank you. I want to acknowledge that we are in the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I honor your families, relatives, and ancestors and say miigwech for welcoming us to your territory today. I am here to speak about building relationships and partnerships that can move us all toward prosperity, economic self-sufficiency, and healthy, vibrant communities. Like many of you, I have a vision of happy, healthy children who are surrounded by the love and care of their families, their immediate and extended families, living in safe, vibrant communities that are grounded in well-being, culture, and language. First, I want to give you an overview of the inherent and treaty rights of our people, and then touch a little bit on the socioeconomic challenges that face many of our communities. In this talk, I want to offer solutions on how we can improve and build more productive relationships. And finally, I'll talk about the path forward based on the Truth and Reconciliation process. The Chiefs of Ontario has been a proud part of the AMO conference over the last few years, as First Nations share so many collective priorities with municipalities and are constantly looking to cultivate strong, positive partnerships between our neighboring communities. The Chiefs of Ontario is an advocacy forum and secretariat for collective decision-making, making as well as action and advocacy for 133 First Nations communities in Ontario. All of our collective priorities are grounded in our inherent and treaty rights. The basis of First Nations governance is natural law, or what Anishinaabe call Inakonagewin. It is the foundation of our nationhood. Our creation stories tell us that we were placed here by the Great Spirit, by God, and we were given these spiritual-based natural laws to govern ourselves. Pre-contact, we were sovereign and self-governing, and this was first recognized in 1763 by the Crown, that is King George III, through the Royal Proclamation. And that stated that lands could not be taken up without making treaties with the various nations in Canada. Therefore, treaties affirm our nationhood and our jurisdiction. They are a recognition of our rights and title, and they set out the terms of a relationship that will actually go on forever. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows and the rivers flow. Despite what has been taught to you, treaties were not a business transaction with a final bill of sale. Underlying title and rights will exist forever, according to our treaties, which is perhaps why First Nations peoples were and continue to be targeted by colonial policies designed to assimilate and in some cases attempt to eradicate us. So you can see First Nations are not third-party stakeholders, nor are we special interest groups. We are rights holders with not just historical documents, but with living international arrangements that affirm our sovereign relationships. Municipalities, although not original partners to the treaties, are considered from a First Nation perspective to be current and valuable partners and certainly benefactors from the treaty process. Therefore, we are all treaty people with equal responsibility to uphold these sacred relationships. And I want to go further and state that freedoms and prosperity and all good things in Ontario exist because of the treaties. The underlying spirit and intent was to share lands and resources with newcomers, and we as First Nations have certainly been honorable in this regard. As First Nations assert their inherent and treaty rights, the relationships that we build will play an important role in determining how the province of Ontario evolves. My hope is that one day First Nations will be lifted up and respected for their foundational contributions to Ontario and Canada. It's important to recognize that a large percentage of First Nations population live off reserve in municipal centers and participate in municipal activities. Initiating and continuing dialogue with our First Nations is essential to building positive connections. I would be remiss if I didn't discuss flare-ups of racism, prejudice, and discrimination against our people in urban settings. And in some towns and cities, the results have been devastating losses of life. One of the chiefs near Kenora, Oneguming First Nation Chief Kathy Kishikweb, sent me a message saying that we require strong, healthy partners to address this matter. We need to hold a collective vision of municipalities where Indigenous people are treated with kindness, dignity, and respect based on deep and abiding love and care that we have for one another. Across Canada, municipal governments and neighboring First Nations are developing stronger relationships. A good example of this is on Manitoulin Island with the Manitoulin Municipal Association and the United Chiefs and Councils of Manadu Minising, sitting down together as full partners so that they can brief island municipalities on the details of land claim negotiations between themselves and the province, among other issues of mutual concern. Aside from land claim negotiations, First Nation communities can find common ground with municipalities. For example, First Nations face unprecedented pressure and demand for investment to run our communities as well. At the same time, we face significant barriers generating revenue and meeting our people's critical needs, resulting in the lowest socioeconomic conditions in Canada. At the core of the social problems is intergenerational trauma associated with colonization. So I just have a few questions. How many of you are parents? Raise your hands. How many of you are grandparents? Anybody who's a great-grandparent? Okay, that's a couple. So imagine your children being ripped from your homes. Imagine your grandchildren suffering the same fate. And then if you live long enough, you see your great-grandchildren taken from you. This is the process that we have endured, not just for 3 generations, but for 12 generations or more. Now ask yourself, could I endure this for even 3 generations and come out of that process healthy, whole, and strong? We all know the answer is no. But we endure as people. We have resiliency. We are still here because of our connections to our lands. The earth is our mother, and she holds us and heals us. While municipalities ebb and flow, have boom and bust cycles, and in some cases get abandoned, this is not an option for our communities. We are tied to our lands forever. Our DNA, our cellular structure is made up of the air, the water, the lands, the plants and animals that we harvest. We can't abandon the only thing that has saved us since time immemorial. Research by the National Aboriginal Health Organization indicates that intergenerational trauma leaves each subsequent generation with less coping skills and less resiliency. But there is hope that this can be reversed and each generation can rebuild, and heal. And land-based healing is a central part of that healing process for us. The second socioeconomic factor for us is that we live under one of the most oppressive constructs in Canada, known as the Indian Act. To give you an idea of the nature of this act, there was a section in the Indian Act that defined a person as any individual other than an Indian. This section remained in the Act until the 1950s. While this and other blatant paternalistic sections were removed over time, the Act itself remains an archaic, disempowering piece of legislation that mires First Nations in red tape, with constant running back to a federal minister on even minute details of governance matters. While municipalities can raise revenue through a tax-based system, First Nations are now only at the very beginning of engaging the Government of Ontario on resource revenue and benefit sharing from resources being extracted from our territories. Now is the time to partner with First Nation neighbors and begin conversations of mutually beneficial outcomes and partnerships involving revenue, resource, and benefit sharing. Ontario has the second largest number of First Nations in Canada, and we also have the second highest number of municipal service arrangements. I truly believe that this speaks to our growing partnership and is something we can all be proud of. You may ask yourself, what is the best way to approach partnerships with First Nations, and how can we begin reconciliation? Here are my suggestions. Reach out to your First Nation neighbors. Think of it as starting a friendship. Begin the conversation with what you have in common, such as shared goals and shared economies. Ask them to partake in your community celebrations and ask if you can partake in theirs. Take time to learn about each other. When your First Nation neighbors are struggling and dealing with tragedies, be present with them. Be a good neighbor and friend. In time, these ripple effects will be felt across the province. The truth is that we all aspire to become dynamic and healthy communities that have sustainable growth. We need to ensure that the value of our communities are recognized across the province. This year's AMO conference is but one way to foster partnerships, share success stories, and allow us to take new ideas back home on how we can better partner together. You may be saying to yourself, reconciliation is a lot of responsibility for one person or even for one community, and you're right. But I am reminded of an initiative coming out of Caledonia and its First Nation neighbor, Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. In fact, Chief Ava Hill of Six Nations is here with us today. The beginnings of this initiative was simple. One teacher who was both from Caledonia and Six Nations considered that some of the fallout from the Douglas Creek Estates land dispute came from a mutual lack of understanding for each other's cultural differences and histories. So she began a pen pal program between the elementary schools and Six Nations in Caledonia. These children wrote each other letters, explaining to each other their unique cultures, whether it was through pictures, historical clippings, or writing about what their mother had made for dinner the night before. At the end of the year, the children all got together and had a celebration, meeting their pen pals for the first time. Caledonia and Six Nations share economies, history, lands, and borders. The communities play sports together, they dine together, celebrate together, and their administrative governments even share emergency services. This idea is perhaps the first stepping stone toward reconciliation when we look toward partnerships and mutual understanding. In conclusion, the only way to long-term prosperity and peace is by building lasting friendships, relationships, and partnerships on the principles of truth and reconciliation. First, the truth and facts of how our people have suffered for hundreds of years under colonization. This truth must be revealed. The purpose of talking about the truth is to build empathy and compassion, not induce guilt. As partners, as neighbors, as leaders, and civic-minded and community-driven professionals, the foundation of our work must be grounded in deep and abiding love that we have and show to one another. When we operate from heart-centered leadership, we find ways to help each other, to lift each other up. Let's begin this walk together, shoulder to shoulder, toward our mutual interests in the full spirit of reconciliation in all of our communities. Miigwech, merci, ninanaskamun, thank you.
I'm offering you this tobacco to thank you for your thoughtful remarks to the delegates that are here today. Miigwech. Could I please ask